The woman paid the beggar's bill. When the manager discovered it, she was fired on the spot. But the next day, a limousine stopped at her door. Subscribe to the channel to follow more exciting stories like this one. The aroma of freshly baked bread wafted through Spencer's bakery as Emma Thompson adjusted her name tag for the 1,000th time that morning. After 15 years of working in the same establishment, the small gesture had become more of a nervous habit than a necessity. The Victorian-style bakery, nestled in the heart of Bath's historic district, had been her second home since she was 24, and every crack in the ornate ceiling, every squeak of the ancient floorboards felt as familiar as her own heartbeat. "Morning rush in 10 minutes," called out Victoria Spencer, the owner, her clipped tone cutting through the warm air like a frost. "And Emma, do remember we're not a charity." That incident with the free scones yesterday cannot happen again. Emma felt her cheeks flush as she remembered how she'd given a young mother an extra scone for her crying child. "Yes, Mrs. Spencer," she replied, turning to arrange the fresh pastries in the display case. The morning light streaming through the large windows caught the sugar crystals atop the croissants, making them sparkle like morning frost. The bell above the door chimed, announcing the first customer of the day. Emma looked up to see an elderly gentleman shuffling in, his clothes worn and weathered, his silver hair unkempt beneath a tattered flat cap. Despite his disheveled appearance, there was something dignified about the way he carried himself, something that spoke of better days. "Good morning, sir," Emma greeted him warmly, ignoring the disapproving glance from her colleague Sarah, who had taken a subtle step backward. "What can I get for you today?" The elderly man approached the counter, his pale blue eyes scanning the display case with careful consideration. "The bread," he said softly, his voice carrying the refined accent of someone well-educated. "The sourdough, please, and perhaps one of those lovely apple turnovers." As Emma carefully wrapped his selections, she couldn't help but notice how his hands trembled slightly as he reached for his wallet. A look of confusion crossed his weathered features as he patted his pockets with increasing urgency. I seem to have," he began, his voice trailing off as embarrassment clouded his face. "I must have left my wallet at... He looked around, seemingly lost in his own thoughts. Emma's heart clenched at the sight of his distress. Behind her, she could hear Sarah whispering to Victoria, their words sharp with judgment. But something in the old man's eyes, a flash of dignity beneath the confusion, made her decision for her. "It's all right, sir," she said quietly, reaching for her own purse beneath the counter. "I'll take care of it." "Emma!" Victoria's voice cracked like a whip. "What do you think you're doing?" But Emma had already rung up the sale, passing her own card through the reader. The total, £7.50, was more than she usually spent on lunch, but she couldn't bear to see the gentleman's dignity stripped away in front of everyone. "Here you are, sir," she said, handing him the paper bag with a smile. "Please enjoy your breakfast." The old man's eyes welled with tears as he accepted the bag, his hands still trembling. "You are very kind," he whispered, before turning slowly and making his way towards the door. As he left, Emma caught a glimpse of him pulling something from his pocket. Not a wallet, but what appeared to be a small notebook, which he studied intently before turning the corner. The bell's cheerful chime had barely faded when Victoria's voice cut through the silence. "My office." "Now?" Emma followed her employer down the narrow hallway, past shelves lined with recipe books that hadn't been opened in years. Victoria's office was a small room dominated by a massive mahogany desk, a relic of grander days when Spencer's had been the premier bakery in Bath. "Sit down," Victoria commanded, lowering herself into her leather chair with all the warmth of a winter storm. "Emma, in the 15 years you've worked here, I've overlooked many things. The extra biscuits you slip to children, the day-old bread you give to the elderly customers at half price. But this, paying for vagrants out of your own pocket, it sets an unacceptable precedent." "He wasn't a vagrant," Emma protested, though she couldn't explain why she felt so certain. "He was just confused. Perhaps he really did forget his wallet." "Your naivety would be charming if it wasn't so dangerous to my business," Victoria replied, her perfectly manicured nails drumming against the desk. "What's to stop him from coming back tomorrow? Or telling his friends about the soft-hearted fool at Spencer's who'll buy their breakfast?" "Mrs. Spencer, please." "No, Emma. I've made allowances because you're an excellent baker, and the customers love you. But I can't have an employee who undermines my authority and ignores policy at will." Victoria's expression hardened. "I'm afraid I'm going to have to let you go." The words hit Emma like a physical blow. 15 years of dedication, of early mornings and late evenings, of perfecting recipes and memorizing regular customers' orders, all undone by a single act of kindness. "You're firing me?" The words felt foreign in her mouth. "Consider it immediate termination. Sarah will cover your shifts until we find a replacement. You can collect your final paycheck at the end of the week." Victoria turned to her computer, a clear dismissal. "Please leave your apron and name tag before you go." Emma stood on shaky legs, her fingers fumbling with the apron strings. As she placed the neatly folded items on Victoria's desk, 15 years of memories flashed through her mind. Her first successful batch of croissants, the Christmas parties, the regular customers who had watched her grow from a nervous 20-something into a confident professional. The walk through the bakery felt like a dream. Sarah wouldn't meet her eyes as she collected her purse from beneath the counter. The morning sun that had seemed so lovely earlier now felt harsh and exposing as she stepped onto the street. Standing on the pavement, Emma hugged herself against the autumn chill, wondering how a simple act of kindness could have cost her so much. Yet even as tears threatened to fall, she knew in her heart she would make the same choice again. With nowhere else to go, she turned toward home, where at least her father and brother would understand. They had always said her heart was both her greatest strength and her greatest weakness. Today, it seemed, they had been right on both counts. The walk home seemed longer than usual as Emma made her way through Bath's winding streets. The Georgian buildings that usually filled her with pride in her hometown's heritage now loomed overhead like silent judges. She passed Royal Victoria Park, where the autumn leaves danced in the breeze, their golden hues a stark contrast to her darkening mood. The Thompson family home sat on a quiet street in Widcombe, a modest 2-story house with a small garden that her father, Robert, tended with religious devotion. As Emma pushed open the gate, she noticed fresh roses blooming despite the season, her father's latest gardening triumph. Before she could reach for her key, the door swung open to reveal Robert Thompson, his reading glasses perched on his nose and concern etched across his kind face. At 65, he still maintained the alertness of the schoolteacher he'd been before retirement. "Emma, what are you doing home so early?" He stepped aside to let her in, his eyes quickly taking in her tear-stained cheeks and missing apron. "Has something happened?" The simple question broke the dam she'd been holding back since leaving Spencer's. Emma collapsed into her father's arms, the familiar scent of his cardigan, a mix of pipe tobacco and Earl Grey tea, providing the comfort she desperately needed. "Dad, I've lost my job," she managed between sobs. "All because I helped someone who needed it." "Michael!" Robert called up the stairs. "Come down, your sister needs us." Heavy footsteps thundered down the staircase as Michael Thompson emerged from his home office, where he worked remotely as a software developer. At 35, he was the spitting image of their late mother, with the same dark curls and expressive brown eyes. "Ems?" he asked, taking in the scene. "What's wrong?" Robert guided Emma to the living room where family photos lined the walls and her mother's old piano sat in the corner, its keys silent but full of memories. As they settled onto the worn leather sofa, Emma recounted the morning's events. The elderly gentleman, his forgotten wallet, Victoria's harsh reaction. 15 years, Michael muttered, pacing the room. 15 years of dedication, and they sack you for showing basic human decency. That's got to be unfair dismissal. "It's not that simple," Emma sighed, accepting the cup of tea her father had prepared. "Victoria's been looking for reasons. The extra biscuits for children, the discounts for pensioners. She's never approved of my overly generous nature, as she calls it." Robert sat beside her, his weathered hand covering hers. "Your mother would be proud of you, sweetheart. She always said kindness was a currency that never runs dry. But it won't pay the bills, will it?" Emma's voice cracked. "I've got the mortgage to think about and my savings won't last forever. You'll stay here until you sort things out," Robert declared firmly. "Your room's exactly as you left it." "Dad, I can't just move back home. I'm 39, not 19. "Of course you can," Michael interjected. "In fact, it's perfect timing. Dad's been complaining about rattling around this big house alone, and I've been trying to convince him to let someone help with the cleaning." Emma managed a weak smile. Her brother had always been protective, ever since their mother's passing 10 years ago. "I suppose a few weeks wouldn't hurt just until I find something new." "Take all the time you need," Robert insisted, "though knowing you, you'll have another job before the week's out. You're the best baker in Bath. Any establishment would be lucky to have you." As if on cue, Emma's phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out, expecting to see a message from one of her now former colleagues, but the number was unfamiliar. "Hello?" she answered tentatively. "Is this Emma Thompson?" a male voice inquired, its tone warm but professional. "Yes, speaking. My name is James Williams. I believe you helped my father at Spencer's Bakery this morning." Emma's heart skipped a beat as she sat up straighter, causing both her father and brother to lean in with curious expressions. "Your father? You mean the gentleman with the flat cap?" "Yes, exactly. I wonder if I might stop by to speak with you. There's something important I need to discuss." Emma glanced at her father, who nodded encouragingly. "Of course, I'm actually at my family's home in Widcombe." After providing the address, Emma ended the call and looked at her anxious audience. "That was the elderly gentleman's son. He wants to come speak with me." "I'll put the kettle on again," Robert announced, rising from the sofa, "and I'll bring out the good biscuits, the ones I've been hiding from your brother." "Oi!" Michael protested, but his eyes twinkled with amusement. "I knew you had a secret stash." As her father busied himself in the kitchen and Michael helped arrange the sitting room to receive their unexpected guest, Emma found herself wondering about James Williams and his father. How had they gotten her number? What could be so important that they needed to discuss it in person? The mystery of it all temporarily displaced her worries about unemployment, and she found herself grateful for the distraction. Whatever came of this meeting, at least she had her family's unwavering support. In the warmth of their love and acceptance, even the worst days seemed manageable. She walked to the window, watching the autumn leaves swirl across the garden. Somewhere in the back of her mind, a small voice whispered that perhaps this wasn't an ending at all, but rather the beginning of something entirely unexpected. After all, as her mother used to say, sometimes life's greatest gifts come wrapped in the plainest packages. The doorbell chimed precisely 30 minutes after the phone call. Emma smoothed her hair nervously as her father went to answer it. Through the frosted glass of the front door, she could make out the silhouette of a tall man. "Mr. Williams? Please come in." Robert's welcoming voice carried from the entryway. The man who stepped into the Thompsons' living room was not what Emma had expected. James Williams appeared to be in his mid-40s, impeccably dressed in a charcoal suit that spoke of quiet wealth. His kind eyes and gentle smile reminded her of his father, though his bearing was altogether more polished. "Miss Thompson," he extended his hand, "thank you for agreeing to see me on such short notice. I'm James Williams." "Please, call me Emma," she replied, gesturing for him to take a seat. "This is my father, Robert, and my brother, Michael." "Would you like some tea, Mr. Williams?" Robert offered, already reaching for the freshly brewed pot. "James, please. And yes, tea would be lovely." He settled into an armchair, his posture relaxed but dignified. "Emma, I want to start by thanking you for your kindness to my father this morning. Not many people would have done what you did." Emma felt her cheeks warm. "It was nothing, really. I just couldn't bear to see him distressed." "It wasn't nothing," James countered, accepting a cup of tea from Robert, "especially given that it cost you your position at Spencer's." Emma's eyes widened. "How did you know about that?" "I have my sources," he smiled mysteriously. "Bath's bakery community is smaller than you might think, but before we discuss that, I need to explain something about my father." He placed his teacup down carefully, his expression growing serious. "My father, George Williams, was once one of the most respected master bakers in the Southwest. He owned Williams & Sons Artisan Bakery on Walcott Street for over 40 years. "Williams & Sons," Michael interrupted. "The one with the blue awning? I pass it every day on my way to the coffee shop." James nodded. "The very same, though these days I manage the business. You see, about 3 years ago, my father was diagnosed with early-onset Alzheimer's." The room fell silent as the implications of this revelation sank in. Emma's heart ached as she remembered the gentleman's confusion that morning. "Most days he's quite well," James continued, "but occasionally he becomes confused and reverts to old habits. He was always known for testing new employees at our bakery, by coming in disguised as a customer who'd forgotten their wallet. He believed that how someone treats those less fortunate reveals their true character. "So this morning," Emma began, realization dawning, he wasn't really confused about his wallet, at least not entirely. In his mind, he was probably doing what he'd done dozens of times before. The difference is now he sometimes forgets it's just a test. James ran a hand through his silver-streaked hair. "We try to keep an eye on him, but he's quite resourceful when he wants to be. This morning he managed to slip away from his carer." Robert leaned forward in his chair. "That explains the notebook I saw him consulting outside the bakery," Emma mused. "He must have been writing down what happened." "Yes, he keeps detailed notes these days. It helps him remember." James's eyes softened with affection. "When he came home and showed me his notebook entry about the kind baker who helped him, I knew I had to find you. Then I heard about Victoria Spencer's reaction." He paused, reaching into his briefcase and withdrawing a folder. "Emma, I have a proposition for you. Williams & Sons is expanding. We're opening a new branch in the Artisan Quarter next month, and we need someone with both technical skill and genuine compassion to manage it." Emma sat up straighter, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. "Are you offering me a job?" "I'm offering you a career," James corrected. "The position comes with full creative control over the menu, a significant salary increase from what Spencer's was paying you, and the opportunity to train our junior bakers. We believe in rewarding kindness and integrity, not punishing it." Michael whistled softly. "That's quite an offer, Ems." "It's more than that," James added. "It's an opportunity to be part of something special. Our father built this business on the principle that a bakery should be the heart of its community. From what I've observed and heard about you, Emma, you embody that same philosophy." Emma's mind was spinning. Just hours ago, she'd been devastated by the loss of her job. Now, sitting in her father's living room, she was being offered not just employment, but a chance to help build something meaningful. I don't know what to say," she managed. "Say you'll at least consider it," James smiled, sliding the folder across the coffee table. "Take a few days to look over the details. Visit our main bakery, talk to our staff. We'd love to have you join our family business, but I understand it's a big decision." Robert beamed at his daughter. "I always said everything happens for a reason, didn't I?" As Emma reached for the folder, her fingers trembling slightly, she caught James watching her with an expression that suggested he already knew what her answer would be. In that moment, she realized that sometimes the biggest changes in life come disguised as small acts of kindness, like helping an elderly man buy his morning bread. "Actually," she heard herself saying, "I don't need a few days. I would be honored to accept the position." James's face broke into a warm smile that reminded her once again of his father. "Welcome to Williams & Sons, Emma. I think this is the beginning of a wonderful partnership." The following Monday morning found Emma standing outside Williams & Sons Artisan Bakery, her heart fluttering with anticipation. The historic building, with its distinctive blue awning and gleaming windows, exuded an air of understated elegance that made Spencer's look almost garish in comparison. Through the window, she could see bakers already at work, their movements precise and practiced as they shaped loaves and laminated pastries. The display cases sparkled in the early morning light, gradually being filled with artisanal creations that made her fingers itch to join in the creative process. "Ready for the grand tour?" James's voice came from behind her. He'd shed his formal suit for a more practical ensemble. Crisp white shirt, dark trousers, and a professional apron bearing the Williams & Sons logo. "More than ready," Emma replied, smoothing down her own new apron, a welcome gift that had arrived at her father's house the previous evening, along with a handwritten note from George Williams himself. The interior of the bakery was a beautiful blend of traditional and modern. Exposed brick walls and wooden beams spoke to the building's heritage, while state-of-the-art equipment gleamed in the kitchen. The space was nearly twice the size of Spencer's, with a mezzanine level that housed a cozy seating area. "This is Martha, our head baker," James introduced her to a woman in her 50s, who radiated competence and warmth. "She's been with us for 20 years and will help you learn our recipes and procedures." "Welcome to the family," Martha smiled, her hands covered in flour as she shaped croissants. "Anyone who shows kindness to our George is all right in my books." As they moved through the bakery, Emma was introduced to the rest of the team. Tom, the young apprentice baker with eager eyes and flour-dusted hair. Sophie, the front-of-house manager, whose friendly demeanor instantly put customers at ease, and several others who all greeted her with genuine warmth. "James has told us all about you. And this," James said, leading her to a small office overlooking the kitchen, "will be your space at the new location. But for now, you'll train here with Martha and get to know our way of doing things." Emma ran her hand along the smooth wooden desk, trying to process the reality of her situation. "It's all a bit overwhelming," she admitted. "In a good way, but still—" "I understand," James nodded, leaning against the doorframe. "It's a big change, but do you know what convinced me you were the right person for this job? It wasn't just your experience or your technical skills, though those are impressive. It was what my father wrote in his notebook about you." He pulled out a small leather-bound journal from his pocket. "May I?" At Emma's nod, he read, "Today I met a baker with sunshine in her smile and kindness in her hands. She didn't see an old fool. She saw a person who needed help. These are the kinds of people who make the world taste sweeter." Emma felt tears pricking at her corners of her eyes. "He wrote that about me." "He did. Dad may be struggling with his memory, but he's still an excellent judge of character." James closed the notebook carefully. "Now shall we get you started? Martha's waiting to show you our signature sourdough process." The morning passed in a whirl of activity as Emma absorbed new techniques and recipes. The Williams & Sons methods were more traditional than what she was used to, with an emphasis on slow fermentation and hand shaping. Yet there was also room for innovation, as evidenced by the seasonal specials board featuring creative flavor combinations. During a brief break, Emma found herself in the small courtyard garden behind the bakery, sipping tea and watching bees buzz around the herb garden. Fresh ingredients for their savory pastries, Martha had explained. "Taking it all in?" James joined her, carrying his own cup of tea. "It's amazing," Emma replied honestly. "Everything here feels so intentional, like every detail has been carefully considered." "That's all Dad's influence," James smiled. "He always said a great bakery should be like a well-proofed loaf. It needs time, attention, and love to rise to its full potential." A comfortable silence fell between them as they watched the bees work. Emma found herself studying James's profile, noting how his expression softened when he spoke about his father. "How often does he visit?" she asked. "Most mornings, when he's having a good day. His carer, Linda, brings him by for breakfast." James turned to face her. "You'll probably see him tomorrow. He's been talking about trying your baking ever since he read his notes about you." The thought both excited and nervous Emma. "I hope I can live up to his expectations." "You already have," James assured her. "But speaking of expectations, let's talk about your ideas for the new branch. We're not looking to create a carbon copy of this location. We want something that reflects your vision too." As they discussed possibilities, Emma felt a growing sense of excitement. This wasn't just a new job. It was an opportunity to create something meaningful, to build on the Williams family legacy while adding her own touch. "Oh, and one more thing," James added, as they headed back inside. "Dad suggested we name the new branch Emma's Corner. He thinks it has a nice ring to it." Emma stopped in her tracks, overwhelmed by the gesture. "But it's your family business. And now you're part of that family," James replied simply. "Besides, Dad insists, and he may be retired, but his word is still law around here." As Emma returned to the kitchen, where Martha was waiting to teach her their famous Chelsea bun recipe, she felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the ovens. Sometimes, she realized, losing your way leads you exactly where you were meant to be all along. The rest of Emma's first week at Williams & Sons passed in a delightful blur of kneading dough, learning recipes, and getting to know her new colleagues. By Friday morning, her muscles ached pleasantly from the physical work, and her notebook was filled with hastily scribbled recipes and techniques. She arrived early that day, just as the sun was beginning to paint the cobblestones with golden light. The familiar scent of brewing coffee and warming ovens greeted her as she entered through the back door, but something felt different. The usually calm morning atmosphere was charged with nervous energy. "Thank goodness you're here." Sophie rushed to meet her, still putting on her apron. "Martha's called in sick, first time in 5 years, and we've got that big order for the university's faculty breakfast meeting." Emma's heart quickened. She'd heard about this order: 30 assorted breakfast pastries, 50 artisanal bread rolls, and their signature sourdough loaves, all needed by 8:30 a.m. It was barely 5:45 now. "Where's James?" she asked, already rolling up her sleeves. "Meeting with suppliers in Bristol. He won't be back until noon." Sophie wrung her hands. "Tom's already started the bread rolls, but he's still learning the laminated pastries." Emma took a deep breath, channeling the calm confidence she'd developed over 15 years of handling bakery emergencies. "Right. Show me Martha's production schedule for today." As Sophie retrieved the clipboard, Emma quickly tied her apron and surveyed the kitchen. Tom was indeed at work, his young face scrunched in concentration as he shaped rolls. The proof box hummed steadily, filled with tomorrow's sourdough doing its slow dance of fermentation. "The pastries need to go in first," Emma decided, scanning Martha's meticulous notes. "Tom, how are those rolls coming along?" "On the second tray of 5, Emma," he called back, a smudge of flour on his cheek. "Perfect. Keep going." "Sophie, I need you to help me with the pastry lamination." Emma pulled out butter blocks from the refrigerator, her mind already calculating timing and oven space. Together, they fell into a rhythm. Emma discovered that Sophie, despite working primarily front of house, had a natural talent for folding pastry. They worked side by side, the quiet morning punctuated only by occasional instructions and the steady thump of Tom's dough shaping. At 7:15, the first batch of pastries emerged from the oven, filling the kitchen with the intoxicating scent of butter and caramel. The bread rolls were proving nicely, their surfaces smooth and promising. "Those look perfect," a familiar voice commented from the doorway. Emma looked up to see George Williams standing there, supported by his carer, Linda. Despite the early hour, he was impeccably dressed in a tweed jacket and bow tie. "Mr. Williams." Emma quickly wiped her hands on her apron. "Good morning." "George, please," he smiled, his eyes twinkling with lucidity. "I hope you don't mind if I observe. It reminds me of the old days watching the morning bake." "Of course not," Emma replied warmly, gesturing to a comfortable chair in the corner that she now realized must be his regular spot. Linda helped him settle in, producing a notebook and pen from her bag. As Emma returned to work, she could hear the scratch of George's pen as he made his observations. Occasionally, he would murmur comments to Linda, who smiled encouragingly. The next hour passed in a focused blur. By 8:15, the order was complete. Perfectly flaky pastries arranged on branded platters, golden bread rolls cooling on racks, and the signature sourdough loaves displaying exactly the right amount of artisanal character. "Masterfully handled," George announced as Sophie and Tom carefully loaded the order into delivery boxes. "You have the touch, my dear. The baker's intuition." Emma blushed at the praise. "Thank you, but it was a team effort." Tom and Sophie were incredible. "Indeed they were," George agreed, making another note in his book. "But a kitchen needs a leader, someone who can stay calm when things go wrong and bring out the best in others. James was right about you." Before Emma could respond, the front door chimed. Through the kitchen window, she could see Victoria Spencer entering the shop, her sharp eyes taking in every detail of the rival establishment. George straightened in his chair, suddenly alert. "Ah, Victoria Spencer. Still wearing those ridiculous heels to work in a bakery, I see." Emma bit back a smile as Sophie went to serve their unexpected visitor. Through the serving hatch, they could hear Victoria's clipped tones. "Just conducting some market research. One of everything, please." "She does this every few months," George confided, his voice low but clear. "Always has, ever since we won the Bath Best Bakery Award 5 years running." As Sophie carefully boxed up Victoria's order, Emma noticed her former employer peering into the kitchen. Their eyes met briefly, and Emma saw a flicker of something, surprise, regret, cross Victoria's face before she turned away. "Well handled, all of you," George declared after Victoria had left. "Emma, would you join me for a cup of tea? I'd like to discuss some ideas for your new branch." As Linda helped George to the small office upstairs, Emma felt a wave of gratitude wash over her. Here was a man who, despite his struggles with memory, had maintained his passion for baking and his ability to recognize it in others. His presence that morning, rather than adding pressure, had somehow made everything feel more manageable. "Go on," Sophie insisted, seeing Emma's hesitation. "Tom and I can handle the morning rush. Besides," she added with a grin, "it's not every day you get to have a masterclass with George Williams himself." Watching George settle into an armchair as Linda prepared tea, Emma realized that sometimes the most valuable lessons come not from formal training, but from quiet moments like these, sharing tea with someone who had spent a lifetime perfecting their craft. And if Victoria's visit had stirred up any doubts about her new path, they were quickly fading in the warm light of George's approval and the satisfaction of a challenge well met. Emma sat across from George in the cozy upstairs office, cradling a cup of Earl Grey as morning sunlight streamed through the window. Linda had discreetly positioned herself by the door, present, but giving them space to talk. "You remind me of someone," George said, studying Emma with clear eyes. "My late wife, Catherine. She had the same way about her in the kitchen, that quiet confidence, the ability to make everyone around her feel capable." "James mentioned she was an amazing baker," Emma replied softly, touched by the comparison. "Oh yes," George smiled, his eyes distant with memory. "She was the one who convinced me to expand the business beyond our first tiny shop. George," she'd say, "good bread, like good people, deserves to be shared." He paused, consulting his notebook. "James tells me you're going to run our new branch?" "Yes, though I'm a bit nervous about it," Emma admitted. "It's a big responsibility." "Nonsense." George waved away her concerns. "You handled this morning's crisis beautifully. But tell me, what's your vision for the new place?" As Emma shared her ideas, a blend of traditional techniques with modern touches, community baking classes, a small cafe area for elderly customers to gather, she watched George taking careful notes, occasionally nodding with approval. Their conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door. James entered, still in his traveling clothes, his face concerned. "I just heard about Martha. Is everything under control?" George interrupted, beaming at Emma. "Our new manager handled it splendidly. The university order went out on time, and she even dealt with Victoria Spencer's little reconnaissance mission." James raised an eyebrow. "Victoria came by. Ordered one of everything," Emma explained. "Your father says it's a regular occurrence. The quarterly inspection." James chuckled, pulling up a chair. "Though her timing today seems a bit pointed." George suddenly straightened, his expression becoming serious. "James, have you shown Emma the secret recipe book yet?" "Dad, I was waiting until—" "No time like the present," George insisted, standing with Linda's help. "It's in the old safe, behind my portrait in the main office. Emma should have it now, especially with the new branch opening." James and Emma exchanged glances, but followed George downstairs to the main office. The portrait in question showed a younger George in his prime, standing proudly outside the original Williams & Sons bakery. James carefully lifted it, revealing a small wall safe. "The combination," George said firmly, "is Catherine's birthday. Go ahead, son." As James entered the numbers, Emma noticed how his fingers trembled slightly. The safe door swung open to reveal a leather-bound book, its pages yellow with age and use. "This," George announced proudly, "is the Williams family legacy. Every special recipe, every secret technique, recorded by 3 generations of bakers." He gestured for James to hand it to Emma. "And now it belongs to you too." "Father, are you sure?" James asked softly. "We've never shared this outside the family." "I'm quite sure," George replied, his voice firm despite his age. "Emma has proven herself worthy of our trust. Besides," he added with a twinkle in his eye, "she's practically family now, isn't she, James?" Emma felt her cheeks warm as she caught James's sudden blush. The moment was interrupted by Linda, gently reminding George about his medication schedule. "Ah, yes, time for my pills," George sighed. "Emma, dear, you study that book, and James—" He paused at the door. "Don't let this one get away like you did with that nice solicitor last year. Some opportunities only come once." After George and Linda left, an awkward silence fell between Emma and James. She clutched the recipe book to her chest, overwhelmed by the trust it represented. "I'm sorry about my father," James finally said, running a hand through his hair. "He can be rather direct these days." "It's fine," Emma assured him, trying to ignore the flutter in her stomach. "He's wonderful." "You're lucky to have him." "I am," James agreed, then gestured to the book. "And he's right about you deserving that. Would you like to go through it together? Over dinner, perhaps?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with possibility. Emma thought about how much her life had changed in just a week, from losing her job to gaining not just a new career, but potentially something more. "I'd like that," she replied softly. "Tonight?" I know a quiet Italian place near the Roman Baths. We could discuss your ideas for the new branch too. James Williams, Emma teased, feeling suddenly bold. Are you trying to combine business with pleasure? He grinned, the tension breaking. Maybe. Is it working? Yes, she admitted, hugging the recipe book closer. Yes, it is. As they returned to the main bakery, where Tom and Sophie were handling the morning rush with growing confidence, Emma felt a warm glow of contentment. The recipe book in her arms represented more than just business secrets. It was a symbol of acceptance, of trust, of belonging. And maybe, just maybe, it was also the beginning of something sweet that had nothing to do with baking at all. The Italian restaurant was tucked away in a quiet corner near the Roman Baths, its warm lighting and exposed stone walls creating an intimate atmosphere. Emma sat across from James, the precious recipe book safely stored in her bag, as they shared a bottle of Chianti and authentic pasta dishes. So, James began, twirling linguine around his fork, tell me more about these community baking classes you mentioned to Dad. I think it's brilliant. Emma's eyes lit up with enthusiasm. Well, I was thinking we could start with basic bread-making workshops for beginners. You know how therapeutic kneading dough can be, and so many people these days are interested in traditional skills. Like occupational therapy through baking? James leaned forward, intrigued. Exactly. And maybe special sessions for elderly residents too. I've noticed at Spencer's how many older customers came in just for a chat. Why not give them something meaningful to do while they socialize? James smiled, watching her animate with passion. So you've really thought this through? I hope I'm not overwhelming you with ideas, Emma said, suddenly self-conscious. It's just, this opportunity means so much to me. Emma, James reached across the table, briefly touching her hand. Your enthusiasm is exactly why Dad and I know we made the right choice. Speaking of Dad, he paused, taking a sip of wine. I'm sorry if he made things awkward earlier with his comments. Emma felt her cheeks warm, and not from the wine. He's very observant. He always has been. Even now with his condition, he sees things others miss. James's expression softened. He noticed how I've been looking at you. The candlelight flickered between them as Emma met his gaze. And how have you been looking at me? Like someone who makes me want to break my rule about mixing business with pleasure, James admitted. Like someone who's turned my carefully ordered world upside down in the best possible way. Before Emma could respond, a familiar voice cut through the moment. Well, isn't this cozy? They looked up to see Victoria Spencer standing at their table, her expression sharp as a knife's edge. She was dressed for dinner, accompanied by a distinguished-looking man in an expensive suit. Victoria, James acknowledged coolly. Lovely to see you. Emma and I were just discussing plans for our new branch. Over candlelight and wine? Victoria's smile didn't reach her eyes. How professional. You know, James, your father and I were quite close competitors once. He would have never dreamed of poaching staff. I didn't poach anyone, Victoria, James replied calmly. You fired an exceptional employee for showing kindness. I simply recognized her value. Emma found her voice. Victoria, Save it, Victoria cut her off. I suppose I should thank you both. Your little drama has given me the perfect excuse to modernize. I've hired a consultant to completely revamp Spencer's. No more old-fashioned notions about community service getting in the way of profit. The man beside her shifted uncomfortably. Victoria, darling, our table's ready. Of course, Charles. She cast one last look at Emma. Do enjoy your business meeting. As Victoria swept away, Emma released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. I'm sorry about that. Don't be. James reached for her hand again, this time holding it. Victoria's always been threatened by genuine connection with customers. It's why Spencer's will never have the loyalty we do. Emma looked down at their joined hands, feeling the warmth of his touch. It's strange. A week ago, I thought losing that job was the worst thing that could happen to me. And now? Now I think it might have been the best. She squeezed his hand gently. Though I have to ask, what is this? Us, I mean. Because if this is just a business dinner... James interlaced their fingers. Emma, I haven't spent an evening like this since Catherine passed away. Dad's right. Some opportunities only come once. I'd very much like to explore where this might lead if you're willing. Even though I work for you? You work with me, he he corrected. And yes, even then, we're both adults who can separate personal and professional lives. Besides, he added with a smile, Dad would never forgive me if I let you get away. Emma laughed, feeling lighter than she had in years. In that case, I think we should order dessert. I need to critique your tiramisu supplier's technique. Always the professional baker, James teased. Speaking of which, Emma grew serious for a moment. What Victoria said about modernizing Spencer's. Should we be worried? James shook his head. Spencer's problem was never about being old-fashioned. It was about losing touch with what really matters in this business. Heart. Something you have in abundance. As they shared a tiramisu and talked late into the evening, Emma realized that sometimes the sweetest recipes are the ones life writes for us when we least expect it. Between the warmth of James's smile and the excitement of their shared vision for the future, she felt something rising in her heart, something as warm and promising as dough proving in the morning light. The evening ended with a gentle kiss on her doorstep, tasting of coffee and possibilities, and a promise to show her the new branch's location tomorrow. As Emma watched James's car disappear down the street, she touched her lips and smiled, wondering what other surprises life had in store for her. The next morning dawned bright and crisp as Emma waited outside her father's house, her mind still dancing with memories of the previous evening's kiss. James had promised to pick her up early to show her the location of the new bakery branch, and her stomach fluttered, with both professional and personal anticipation. Her sleek blue car pulled up, and James stepped out looking handsome in a casual weekend outfit of jeans and a blue sweater that matched his eyes. "Good morning," he smiled, opening the passenger door for her. "Ready to see your new kingdom?" The drive took them through Bath's historic streets, past the Royal Crescent and down towards the Artisan Quarter. Emma noticed they were heading toward an area that had recently undergone regeneration, with independent shops and cafes bringing new life to once quiet streets. "Here we are," James announced, pulling up in front of a Georgian building with large windows and elegant proportions. "What do you think?" Emma stepped out of the car, her professional eye immediately assessing the potential. The building was on a corner, offering excellent visibility and natural light. The surrounding businesses, an independent bookshop, a craft supply store, and a vintage clothing boutique, seemed to attract exactly the kind of customers who would appreciate artisanal baking. "It's perfect," she breathed, already envisioning the layout in her mind. "Those windows will be amazing for displaying our goods, and look at all the foot traffic." James produced a set of keys. "Shall we look inside?" The interior was currently empty, but Emma could see past the bare walls and dusty floors to what it could become. The space was larger than she'd expected, with high ceilings and original features like a beautiful fireplace and ornate cornicing. "We'll need to install the ovens along that wall," she said, pointing. "And maybe create a seating area near the fireplace for those community classes we discussed." "I was thinking the same thing," James agreed, watching her with obvious admiration. "The basement's been converted too, perfect for storage and prep areas." As they explored the space together, their hands occasionally brushing, Emma felt a surge of excitement about the future. However, a nagging thought kept intruding. "James," she said finally, "about last night, and Victoria's comments. Are you sure this us won't complicate things?" He turned to face her, his expression serious. "Emma, I've spent years putting the business first, keeping everyone at arm's length. But seeing how Dad responded to you, how naturally you fit into our world, it made me realize that sometimes the best things in life are worth the complications." Before she could respond, their moment was interrupted by the sound of approaching voices outside. Through the dusty window, they could see Victoria Spencer walking past with the same well-dressed man from the restaurant, Charles, and what appeared to be a property agent. "The renovation plans are already drawn up," they heard Victoria saying. "Once we've modernized Spencer's, we can look at expanding. This area is ripe for a high-end patisserie." Emma and James exchanged glances. "She's planning to open a competing bakery right in this neighborhood," Emma whispered. "It's a free market," James shrugged, though his jaw had tightened. "But we have something she'll never have: authentic connection with our customers and generations of expertise." As if to prove his point, an elderly couple stopped outside, peering through the windows. The woman's face lit up when she recognized James. "Mr. Williams," she called out, waving. "Are you opening a new shop here? Please say yes. We've missed having a proper bakery in the neighborhood since Henderson's closed." James opened the door to greet them, and soon Emma found herself deep in conversation with Mrs. Patterson, a former regular customer of the original Williams & Sons who lived just around the corner. Her husband, it turned out, had been taking baking classes to help with his arthritis. "That's exactly the kind of program we're planning to offer here," Emma explained enthusiastically. "Community baking sessions, workshops." "Oh, lovely." Mrs. Patterson clapped her hands. "The old Hendersons used to do something similar, didn't they, Harold? It brought everyone together. Not like that fancy new place they're putting in down the road. All style and no substance, if you ask me." After the Pattersons left, promising to spread the word about the new bakery, Emma turned to James with renewed determination. "Victoria can try to compete with us on products, but she can't replicate years of community connection." "That's the spirit," James smiled, pulling her close. "And speaking of connection," he leaned in for a kiss, but Emma playfully ducked away. "Careful, Mr. Williams. The windows are very large and the neighborhood seems quite observant." "Let them observe," he murmured, but settled for squeezing her hand instead. "Now, shall we measure up for those ovens? Dad's coming over later to look at the space, and you know he'll want every detail planned out." As they spent the morning plotting layouts and discussing equipment, Emma felt her two worlds, personal and professional, beginning to intertwine in the most delightful way. Victoria's plans might pose a challenge, but standing in the sunlight-filled space with James, surrounded by possibility, she couldn't bring herself to worry too much. After all, the best recipes often require a bit of risk-taking to achieve something truly special. 3 weeks into Emma's training at the main Williams & Sons bakery, autumn was in full swing. Golden leaves scattered across Bath's cobblestone streets, and the morning air carried a crisp chill that made freshly baked bread even more appealing to passing customers. Emma stood at the workbench, carefully demonstrating lamination techniques to Tom while Martha observed approvingly. The young apprentice had made remarkable progress under Emma's patient guidance, and his croissants were becoming consistently excellent. "That's it," Emma encouraged, watching Tom fold the butter-laden dough with growing confidence. "Remember to keep your movements precise but gentle. We want distinct layers, not butter smears." The kitchen radio hummed softly in the background, its familiar chatter providing a pleasant accompaniment to their work. However, the morning calm was suddenly interrupted by a news announcement that made them all pause. Local business news: Bath's historic Spencer's Bakery announces major modernization plans, including a new high-end patisserie branch. Owner Victoria Spencer promises to revolutionize the city's baking scene with innovative techniques and international influences. Martha switched off the radio with a snort. International influences? Victoria Spencer wouldn't know a proper French croissant if it flew across the channel and hit her in the face. "She's certainly being aggressive with her expansion plans," Emma mused, trying to keep her voice neutral despite her concern. The announcement had mentioned a location suspiciously close to their new branch. The bell above the shop door chimed, and through the kitchen window, Emma saw George entering with Linda. Today seemed to be one of his better days. He was dressed sharply and carried himself with his old confidence. "Something smells wonderful," he declared, making his way to the kitchen. "Ah, young Tom working on your lamination, I see. Very good form." Tom beamed at the praise, carefully sliding his completed pastries onto a baking sheet. George watched the process with approval before turning to Emma. "My dear, might I borrow you for a moment? There's something I'd like to discuss." In the small office upstairs, George settled into his usual chair while Linda prepared tea. Emma noticed he had brought his notebook and what appeared to be an old photo album. "I heard Victoria's announcement on the radio this morning," he began, his eyes sharp and clear. "It reminded me of something from the past that might help us now." He opened the photo album carefully. "Do you know why Williams & Sons has survived for 3 generations while other bakeries came and went?" Emma shook her head, accepting a cup of tea from Linda. "Because we've always understood that a bakery is more than just a business. It's a cornerstone of the community. Look here." He pointed to a yellowed photograph showing a much younger George standing proudly outside the original shop. A queue of customers stretched down the street. "This was taken during the winter of 1963, he explained. "Terrible weather. Supplies were difficult to get. But we stayed open, Made do with what we had, shared what we could. People remembered that. He turned the page to another photograph, this one showing a group of elderly ladies seated at tables in the shop, clearly engaged in some sort of class or gathering. Your idea about community baking classes? We used to do something similar back then, called it kneading together, gave people a reason to get out of the house, meet others, learn something new. His eyes twinkled. Catherine came up with that name. She always had a way with words. Emma studied the photographs, noting the warm, welcoming atmosphere that seemed to radiate from them. It's exactly what I hope to create at the new branch. Which is why I want you to have this. George pulled an envelope from his notebook. Catherine's original recipes for our community events. Simple things that anyone can learn to make, but with little touches that make them special. She would have wanted you to have them. Emma's hands trembled slightly as she accepted the envelope. George, I don't know what to say. Say you'll use them to bring people together like she did. He patted her hand. Victoria can have all the modern equipment and international influences she wants, but she'll never understand that the secret ingredient in good baking isn't found in any recipe book. It's love, Emma finished softly, thinking of all the morning bakes she'd shared with her new colleagues, the growing confidence in Tom's eyes, the way James looked at her over recipe discussions. Exactly, George nodded approvingly. Now let's go see how young Tom's croissants turned out, shall we? And perhaps you can tell me how your dinner with my son went the other night. He's been walking around with his head in the clouds ever since. Emma blushed, but couldn't hide her smile. As they made their way back downstairs, she could hear the busy sounds of the morning rush beginning. The bell chiming as customers entered, Sophie's cheerful greetings, the smell of fresh coffee mingling with baked goods. Victoria might be planning a grand modernization, but Emma was increasingly confident that what they were building, both in the original bakery and the new branch, was something far more valuable than mere innovation. They were maintaining a legacy of community, connection and care that no amount of international influence could replicate. And as she watched George praise Tom's perfectly laminated croissants, Emma realized that sometimes the best way to face the future is to honor the past while adding your own special ingredients to the mix. The renovation of Emma's new bakery branch was progressing rapidly. The space had been transformed from an empty shell into a welcoming haven, with warm cream walls, exposed brick features, and gleaming new equipment. The original fireplace had been restored to working condition, creating a cozy corner for the planned community gatherings. Emma stood in the center of what would soon be the main serving area, reviewing the delivery schedule for the remaining equipment with James. The autumn sunlight streamed through the newly cleaned windows, casting a golden glow over the space. The last of the ovens arrives tomorrow, James confirmed, checking his tablet. We're still on track for the soft opening next week. Perfect timing for the autumn menu launch, Emma replied, consulting Catherine's recipes that George had given her. I've been adapting some of these for modern tastes, but keeping the essence of what made them special. James moved behind her, peering over her shoulder at the handwritten notes. Mom would have loved that, he said softly, his breath warm against her ear. She was always experimenting with traditional recipes. Their moment was interrupted by a commotion outside. Through the windows, they could see workers installing an enormous ultra-modern sign on the building across the street. Spencer's Nouveau, Artisanal Patisserie and Café. Well, Emma sighed, I guess that confirms the rumors about where Victoria's new branch would be. Rather obvious tactics, aren't they? James frowned. Opening directly opposite us, rushing to beat our launch date. The door chimed as Martha hurried in, looking flustered. You need to see this, she said, holding out her phone. On the screen was Spencer's Bakery's social media page, announcing their new venture. Experience the future of baking. Spencer's Nouveau brings Paris to Bath with state-of-the-art techniques and exclusive recipes from renowned French pastry chefs. Opening next week with special introductory offers and free coffee for the first month. Free coffee? Emma bit her lip. That will definitely attract customers. Let them have their gimmicks, James said firmly. We're offering something more valuable than free coffee. Speaking of which, Martha interjected, you might want to come outside. There's someone here you should meet. They followed Martha onto the street, where an elderly woman was examining their window display of upcoming class schedules. Emma recognized her immediately from the photographs George had shown her. "Mrs. Patterson," she exclaimed. "How lovely to see you again. I brought some friends." Mrs. Patterson gestured to the small group of elderly residents with her. "We were all part of the original Kneading Together group at the old Williams and Sons. When Harold told us you were reviving the classes," one of the women stepped forward. "I learned to make bread in George's classes 40 years ago," she said proudly, "taught my children, and now my grandchildren. When we heard about Victoria Spencer's fancy new place, we wanted you to know, loyalty isn't bought with free coffee." Emma felt tears prick at her eyes. "Would you like to come in and see the space? The teaching area isn't quite finished, but—" "Oh yes, please," the group chorused enthusiastically. As Emma led them through the bakery, explaining their plans for different classes and community events, she could see their eyes lighting up with recognition and approval. These weren't just potential customers. They were living connections to the Williams family legacy. "The fireplace," one woman noted emotionally, "just like in the old shop. Many a cold morning we warmed ourselves there while learning to prove dough. And look," another pointed to the large wooden table Emma had specially commissioned. "Perfect for group work, just like George always insisted on." James watched from the doorway, his expression soft as Emma engaged with the group. She was in her element, discussing recipes and techniques, listening to their stories, making notes about their suggestions for class times and topics. The moment was interrupted by the sound of drilling from across the street. Victoria Spencer had arrived to inspect the installation of her new sign, her heels clicking on the pavement as she deliberately walked past their windows, speaking loudly into her phone. "Yes, the French pastry chef arrives next week. Top of his class at Le Cordon Bleu. Of course we'll be ready before them." No, darling, trust me. Once people taste our authentic French pastries, they won't settle for ordinary local fare." Mrs. Patterson shook her head disapprovingly. "Authentic French pastries, indeed, as if Bath hasn't had proper French baking since before she was born. Why, I remember when George's wife, Catherine—" "Would you like to hear more about Catherine's recipes?" Emma asked quickly, guiding the group away from the windows. "We're actually planning to use some of her original formulas, with a few modern tweaks." The afternoon passed pleasantly as Emma shared stories and recipes with the former Kneading Together members. By the time they left, she had a list of people eager to join the new classes and promises to spread the word throughout their community. "That," James said as he closed the door behind the last visitor, "is exactly what Dad meant about community being our secret ingredient." Emma nodded, looking around the space that was rapidly becoming her dream come true. Victoria can have her French chef and modern techniques. We have something better. "We certainly do." James pulled her close, no longer worried about who might see through the windows. "We have heart. And speaking of hearts—" He hesitated for a moment. "Emma, I know we've only known each other a short while, but—" The rest of his sentence was cut off by Martha bursting through the door. "Sorry to interrupt, but George is asking for both of you at the main shop. Says it's important. Something about Victoria's new chef." Emma and James exchanged glances, their personal moment once again deferred by business matters. But as they hurried back to the main bakery, their hands found each other, fingers intertwining naturally. Whatever challenge Victoria Spencer was planning next, they would face it together, with tradition, community, and love on their side. When Emma and James arrived at the main Williams and Sons bakery, they found George sitting in his usual chair, his expression uncharacteristically troubled. Linda hovered nearby, a cup of tea growing cold on the desk beside him. "Dad?" James asked, concern evident in his voice. "What's wrong?" George looked up, his eyes clearing as he focused on them. "Ah, good, you're both here. It's about Victoria's new French chef." He consulted his notebook before continuing. "Pierre Dubois. I knew him years ago. He trained under Catherine in Paris before we were married." Emma sat down, intrigued. "Catherine trained chefs in Paris." "Oh yes," George smiled fondly. "She was quite renowned in certain circles. Pierre was one of her most promising students, but he was also—" He paused, searching for the right words. "More interested in fame than authenticity." "What do you mean?" James asked, pulling up another chair. George carefully opened his notebook to a marked page. "Pierre believes in style over substance. Catherine used to say he could make beautiful pastries that looked perfect but lacked soul. After she declined to recommend him for a prestigious position, he became bitter. And now he's working with Victoria." Emma mused, pieces falling into place. It can't be a coincidence. No, George agreed. Pierre has been trying to acquire our family recipes for years. Victoria must have promised him access to them somehow. He turned to Emma. That's why I gave you Catherine's recipes when I did. I knew they would be safer with you. The weight of this trust settled over Emma like a warm blanket. But surely Victoria can't think... She was interrupted by the shop bell ringing. Through the office window, they could see Victoria herself entering, accompanied by a tall, distinguished-looking man in chef's whites. "Ah, Pierre," George said softly, "right on schedule." They made their way downstairs, where Victoria was making a show of examining the display cases. Pierre Dubois stood beside her, his critical gaze sweeping the bakery. "George," he said, his French accent thick but his English perfect. "It has been many years." "Indeed it has, Pierre." George's voice was steady, his bearing dignified despite his age. "I see you've found a new patron. Yes, one who appreciates innovation and progress." Pierre's eyes landed on Emma. "And who is this?" "Emma Thompson," Victoria answered before anyone else could. "My former employee who now seems to think she can run a bakery." "She's not just running it," George interjected firmly. "She's carrying on Catherine's legacy." Pierre's expression darkened slightly at the mention of Catherine's name. "Ah, yes, always Catherine's legacy. Tell me, George, does she still use those old-fashioned techniques, the ones Catherine was so insistent about?" "Some traditions exist for a reason," Emma found herself saying. "They're not just about technique, they're about heart." "Heart?" Victoria scoffed. "This is business, dear. Hearts don't pay bills." "No?" Emma gestured to the shop full of customers, many of whom were watching the exchange with interest. "Ask any of our regulars why they come here. It's not just for the bread." Mrs. Patterson, who happened to be picking up her daily loaf, stepped forward. "She's right, you know. We come here because every bite tastes like home." Other customers nodded in agreement. Pierre's professional demeanor cracked slightly as he took in the scene. "I remember when you understood that, Pierre," George said quietly. "Catherine always said you had the potential to be great, not just famous." Something flickered in Pierre's eyes. Regret, perhaps, or remembrance. He turned to Victoria. "Madam Spencer, I fear I must withdraw from our arrangement." "What?" Victoria's voice rose sharply. "But our opening is next week. The contracts are not yet signed," Pierre finished smoothly. "And I find I cannot, how do you say, compete with ghosts." He looked at Emma. "Or with those who truly understand their power." As Pierre walked out, leaving a sputtering Victoria behind, Emma felt James's hand slip into hers. George was smiling, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "Well," Victoria managed finally, drawing herself up, "this changes nothing. I can find another chef." "Of course you can," George agreed mildly. "But can you find another heart?" After Victoria stormed out, the bakery erupted in excited chatter. Regular customers who had witnessed the scene came up to express their support, sharing stories of what Williams and Sons meant to them and their families. Emma found herself surrounded by warmth and love, not just from the customers and staff, but from the very walls of the bakery itself. Each brick seemed to hold memories of generations of bakers who had poured their hearts into their craft. As the excitement died down, James pulled her aside. "Emma, about what I was trying to say earlier." But once again they were interrupted, this time by George calling everyone's attention. "I think," he announced with a twinkle in his eye, "this calls for a celebration, and I know just the recipe." Emma smiled, knowing the moment with James would come when it was right. For now, she had a family legacy to honor, a community to serve, and a future to bake, one loaf at a time. 3 months had passed since the confrontation with Victoria and Pierre. The winter air was crisp and cold, but inside Emma's new bakery, now officially known as Emma's Corner, a Williams and Sons bakery, warmth and delicious aromas filled every corner. The grand opening had been a tremendous success, with lines stretching around the block. Victoria's competing patisserie had opened 2 weeks later, but without Pierre's involvement, it struggled to find its identity. Last week, Emma had heard rumors that Victoria was considering selling the business and retiring to London. On this particular morning, Emma stood in her kitchen, surrounded by the gentle hum of activity. The community baking class was in full swing, with Mrs. Patterson and her friends teaching a group of young mothers how to make traditional Christmas puddings. The restored fireplace crackled merrily, and the large wooden table was dusted with flour and good cheer. "You've created something wonderful here," James's voice came from behind her. He had been spending more and more time at Emma's corner, supposedly overseeing operations, but mostly finding excuses to be near her. "We all did," Emma corrected him, turning to face the man who had become such an essential part of her life. It's amazing what can grow from one small act of kindness. Through the kitchen window, they could see George arriving for his daily visit, supported by Linda, but walking with determination. He had taken to holding court in the corner by the fireplace, sharing stories with customers, and offering gentle advice to the baking students. "Speaking of growth," James said, taking Emma's flour-dusted hands in his, "there's something I've been trying to ask you for months now, but we keep getting interrupted." Emma's heart skipped a beat. "Yes?" "The thing is," he continued, "I've fallen in love with you. Not just because you're brilliant with the business, or because Dad adores you, or even because you make the best sourdough in Bath, but because you showed me that true success isn't measured in profits or awards. It's measured in the joy we bring to others." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small vintage ring box. "This was my mother's. Dad gave it to me last week and said it was time." Opening the box, he revealed a delicate gold ring with a small diamond. "Emma Thompson, will you marry me and become an official part of our family?" Before Emma could respond, they heard a gasp. The entire baking class had gone silent, watching the scene unfold. George stood in the doorway, beaming with approval. "Yes," Emma whispered, then louder, "Yes!" The kitchen erupted in cheers and applause. "Mrs. Patterson wiped tears from her eyes, while Linda helped George make his way over to embrace them both. "Perfect timing, son," George said proudly. "Now we can make the other announcement." Emma looked between father and son, confused. "What other announcement?" James slipped the ring onto her finger before explaining, "Dad's decided to officially retire. He wants us to take over the entire Williams & Sons business together, both locations. But only if you want to," George added quickly. "The new branch is doing so well, and your community programs are exactly what Catherine always dreamed of." "Of course I want to," Emma assured him, squeezing his hand, "as long as you promise to keep visiting and sharing your wisdom." "Wild horses couldn't keep him away," Linda laughed. "He makes me bring him here even on his bad days." The celebration continued throughout the morning, with regular customers dropping in to share their congratulations. Tom and Sophie came from the main bakery, bringing with them a special engagement cake they'd secretly prepared. As Emma looked around at her extended family, the Williams men who had given her such an amazing opportunity, the staff who had become dear friends, the customers who had become part of their community, she remembered that morning at Spencer's that had seemed so disastrous at the time. "Penny, for your thoughts?" James asked, slipping an arm around her waist. "I was just thinking about how life's greatest blessings often come disguised as setbacks," she replied, leaning into him. "If I hadn't lost my job that day, if you hadn't shown kindness to a confused old mammies," he continued, "if you hadn't taken a chance on hiring me, if Dad hadn't played matchmaker." They laughed together, watching as George regaled the baking class with tales of his courtship with Catherine. The Christmas puddings were forgotten for the moment, but no one seemed to mind. Later that afternoon, as the winter sun began to set early, Emma stood in the doorway of her bakery, her home really, and smiled at the sight before her. George was teaching his signature bread-kneading technique to a young apprentice. James was helping Mrs. Patterson pack up her baking supplies, and the whole space hummed with the kind of contentment that comes from being exactly where you're meant to be. The bell above the door chimed as the last customers of the day departed, calling out, "See you tomorrow," as they left. Emma knew they would indeed be back, not just for the bread and pastries, but for the sense of belonging that made Williams & Sons so special. As James joined her in the doorway, slipping his hand into hers, she caught the glint of her new ring in the fading light. Together, they watched the first snowflakes of winter begin to fall, dusting Bath's ancient streets with promise. Sometimes the sweetest recipes in life are the ones we never expected to make, the ones that combine equal parts challenge and charm, tradition and innovation, and most importantly, love. In Emma's case, losing her job had led her not just to a new career, but to a new family, a new purpose, and a love story worthy of Bath's romantic history. And as she locked up that evening, arm in arm with her fiancé, she knew that this was just the beginning of their story, one that would be measured out in cups of flour, spoonfuls of sugar, and countless moments of joy shared with the community they served.